Hello, Oral Com. My name is Mr. Rohman. I'll be your teacher for this semester. I'm really sorry that I couldn't make it for the first day of class. I'm traveling back from Nashville, Tennessee. I look forward to meeting everyone tomorrow, and we'll go over things like the syllabus tomorrow. At this point, you should have already taken a Google survey. That's just for a way for me to get to know all of you a little bit more. I'll take a look at those, and we'll be introducing ourselves to each other tomorrow. So today I want to start with what is communication. So we're going to define communication today. We're also going to take a look at the model of communication and how that plays out. And then at the end you're going to respond to a discussion post looking at that. So let's go ahead and get started. So there are several different definitions of communication. If you put 100 different communication scholars in one room, you would come up with 100 different definitions of communication. So I'm just going to run through a few different ones here, and then we'll look at what we're going to define communication as a class. So first, a communication scholar by the name of DeVito defined communication is the process or act of communicating. So I'm sure, as you can see here, this has this whole idea of the word communicating is in the definition of communication. So, that's kind of a weakness of this definition, but we do have this idea that it's a process or an act. It's not singular. It happens continuously. So let's take a look at another definition, this time by a man named Verteber. And Verteber says communication is the process of sharing information by using symbols to send or receive messages. Well, I see the idea that there's a process. We're sharing some information. That's good. Symbols, that's pretty vague. That's pretty general. I always like to remind myself, well, what is a symbol? A symbol is one thing that represents another thing. And to send or receive messages. So, this is a little more detailed. It kind of talks more about what is communicating, but it still is a little limiting. The final other definition, the Oxford English Dictionary definition, the OED, always a good resource if you're looking up what a definition of something is. Communication, the transmission or exchange of information, knowledge, or ideas by means of speech, writing, mechanical, or electronic media. So obviously this is a dictionary definition. It's a little more precise than the other definitions. We still have this idea it's a process or exchange of information. We have some very specific ways in which it can be done, but sometimes when we get specific, like speech, writing, mechanical, or electronic media, well, that then prohibits us from exploring something that's new or a different way, or even some nonverbal communication, which is absolutely a way we can communicate that we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks. So these are just three different definitions. If you've written any of this down, that's fine. You certainly don't have to. The rest of the information moving forward, I would like you to jot down in your notes. We will have an exam probably late next week, early the following week, and over this introductory unit, and you're going to be responsible for that information on that exam. So let's take look at our definition of communication. This is our classroom definition. Communication, the process of intentionally or unintentionally creating a shared meaning through the use of symbols. Communication is the process of intentionally or unintentionally creating a shared meaning through the use of symbols. So obviously there's a lot here, so let's break it down. Once again, we have this idea of process. I kept that from those other definitions because I think that it's really important. Communication doesn't just happen once. It's an ongoing process. Intentionally or unintentionally. Communication scholars are really divided on this. To have intent means you mean to do it. The idea is that you have an idea you want to communicate, and so you make sure that you are communicating it to the audience you're communicating to. but sometimes we unintentionally send those messages. Think about the fact if you're looking at someone, you're down in the lounge and you wave to someone from across the lounge, and let's say someone else waves back that you weren't even looking at. Well, you unintentionally probably sent them a message indicating that, well, hey, I want to wave to you. So that unintentional communication is really important. Creating a shared meaning. We have to both agree, both parties in communication have to agree upon what it means. If we don't, then we have to start from square one. And obviously through the use of symbols. A thing that represents another thing. That could be the language we use, that could be signs, that could be letters, that could be hand gestures, facial expressions. We'll talk about all the different types of symbols that we can use to communicate with another individual or another group of individuals. So obviously there's some strengths here. It has this idea, it really is all-encompassing. It allows for a bunch of different ways of communicating as long as we're using symbols. Creating shared meaning, obviously intentionally or unintentionally, that's something too. And maybe a weakness is, what does shared meaning mean? How do we know we've accomplished shared meaning? As a teacher, I'm always thinking of, have I really communicated with my students what I mean? And sometimes, for the sake of just wanting to move on, or maybe you think you understand something a teacher says to you or has explained to you, and then you really don't. And so that shared meaning can be where things can break down a little bit. So that's our definition of communication. For this next part, we're going to talk about the communication model, and what I want you to do is set up your notes in a way in which you can have the diagram I'm going to show you on one part, and then the definitions in another part. So maybe turn your paper landscape and do it half and half, or have your model drawing at the top of the page and your other stuff your definitions at the bottom. So today we're just going to talk about the basics of the model. So the first part we have here is the sender. So go ahead and jot that down wherever you're creating your model on your notes. We have the sender. And the sender is the person or group originating the message. The person or group originating the message. So a sender can be a single person. It can also be a group. So right now I am a single person sending you, the group, a message. When school gets called off, for a snow day, Dr. Kinley would send a message out via Sky Alert, and at that point, Dr. Kinley is speaking on the behalf of the ISU lab schools, or as the group. So that can work in multiple different ways, and sometimes you have to think about, are you sending the message, are you the sender as an individual, or as part of that group? So that's the sender. That's the first part of the communication model. Well, if we have a sender, on the other side, we have to have a receiver. And sometimes there can be multiple receivers. So as you see here, we're going to add to our definitions. Receivers, they're the intended recipient of the message, and it's also the location where meaning is created. The intended recipient of the message and the location where meaning is created. So obviously, the receivers should be the intended recipient, but we know that sometimes we send messages to the unintended recipient, and they still act as a receiver. And it's really important then we think about the location where meaning is created. I know what I mean when I have a message, but I have to know, as a sender, I have to be able to communicate in a way that my meaning can be shared by the receiver. And so that's why it's important to put that kind of onus, that responsibility on the receiver. And you'll see as we develop the model how we can make sure that shared meaning is actually achieved. So we have a sender, we have a receiver. We now need to add a message. So draw an arrow from sender to receiver, and it's really important you curve it up because we are going to put something right in the middle there. And we have the message. And so the message is the information the sender desires to have understood, or essentially the data used to create meaning. The information the sender desires to have understood. Everything that I've said in this video so far is just that. It's my message. It's the information that I want you all to be able to understand. We send messages constantly. Obviously, sometimes we are clearer with those messages than other times, but at the end of the day, we send a lot of messages. We're using this information to hopefully create that shared meaning with our receiver or our receivers. So right through the middle now, draw a big arrow across and put channel. We have this thing right in the middle. It's the channel. Obviously, we all send messages in different ways, and that's exactly what the channel is. Any means that provides a path for moving the message from the sender to the receiver. Any means that provides a path for moving the message from the sender to the receiver. I'm sure several of you have communicated in a dozen different ways already today. Whether you were sending very intentional messages, maybe you texted someone, maybe you've already had a phone call with someone, maybe you've had face-to-face interactions. The list can go on and on, but the channel is that way in which we choose to communicate. And obviously different channels also call for different levels of communication. So if I'm texting, then I'm going to communicate in a slightly different way than if I'm talking face-to-face. If I'm texting or I'm communicating with my recipient, my receiver also depends on that, because I might text or email a friend in one way versus a parent or versus a teacher. And so you have to be thinking about that, and these all dictate how you communicate with other people. You have to be thinking about the receiver. So we have a sender, receiver. The sender has a message that they're going to send through a channel. But there's a process that has to happen in order for that communication to be successful. So we have, if you see on the left-hand side here, we have encoding. So the sender has to encode a message, and then the receiver has to decode that message. So encoding is translating the message into appropriate symbols. Obviously, then decoding is just the opposite, translating the symbols back into the message. Encoding, translating the message into appropriate symbols. Decoding, translating the symbols back into the message. So what we have going on here is the idea that when the sender has a message, it's up to the sender to determine, based on the message and the channel, what are the appropriate symbols, what are the appropriate words to use, the appropriate slang and lingo, and the appropriate way in which to communicate that message. It's maybe not appropriate to break up with someone, end a relationship with someone via text message. You probably want to do that face to face. But then you also have to think about the fact of, you have to use symbols and appropriate symbols that your receiver will understand. So, for example, you can't use certain texting lingo with someone that may not understand what that texting lingo means. So, because then it's up to the receiver to translate the symbols that they've been communicated back into the message. And so that encoding and decoding process, obviously there are a lot of opportunities in that process for communication breakdown to occur. So, we have a message that's been sent to a receiver. The receiver has decoded that message from the channel, and now they get to encode feedback back to the sender for the sender to decode. The channel is still in place. Sometimes that channel is the same in that feedback loop. Other times that channel changes. And so it's up to the receiver to determine, is that feedback appropriate or not? in that original channel. Sometimes, like for example, sometimes I'll get a text message that I know I need to just call the person to talk to them, or I need to see them face to face. Or oftentimes, there are times where I'll get emails from students with questions over the weekend, and I get 2 or 3 emails, and so I could send basically the same email, or if it's not time sensitive, I can just address it with the entire class on Monday, and I oftentimes will do that. So feedback is the verbal or nonverbal reply. If I was in class today, I would be able to potentially see if any of you look confused or if you look confident in what you're doing, what you're saying, etc. And so I would be able to see that nonverbal feedback as well, and I could adjust my message accordingly. And then obviously there's one last thing here. The whole communication model here, this whole thing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in real life. It happens in the context or environment, which is the time and place of the communication event. And we also can think of this as the cultural and timely situation. The time and place of the communication event. The cultural and timely situation. I actually think about this whole idea of context and environment a lot. When I go back to watch older TV shows that might make jokes that are no longer appropriate. There are certain TV shows that just don't age well. There are TV shows from the 1950s and 60s that show a family that doesn't look like what families look like back then, and certainly don't look like what families look like today. So we have to think about what is the cultural and timely situation. When we're thinking about the speeches that you're going to have to give in this class, you're going to be giving them in this classroom in front of the students that you're sitting around and myself. You're going to be giving them in 2019 in the spring semester at University High School. And so as you're thinking about what your message is, you have to be considering those things. Who is in your audience? What's important about that audience? Because that's really important as well. So it's essential for you to be thinking about what is that context, who is my receiver, how can I make these adjustments. Tomorrow we're going to come back to this. We're going to talk about how some things can get in the way of this communication process. So there are a couple of other things I want you to think about for today. The first is, once you're done, once this video is over, I want you to navigate back to Blackboard, and I want you to go to the discussion board tab on the left-hand side, and there's going to be a discussion board there for you to post and consider a communication event that you participated in. So I just want you to take a sentence or two to explain that communication event, who is the sender, who is the receiver, stuff like that, what was the message, and then what made it either a successful communication event or an unsuccessful communication event. What are things that maybe could have changed to make it more successful from the very beginning? Because that's really important to understand that, obviously if I provide feedback to the sender then has to send another message, and that loop continues until hopefully we actually have successful communication. It's not just one message with one piece of feedback. And so I want you to think about that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is not something you have to worry about today or even tomorrow. On Wednesday, you'll be getting here after this video an assignment sheet for the Any Old Bag speech. I will actually be demonstrating the Any Old Bag speech for you at the beginning of class tomorrow. What you'll have to do is bring in a bag that's important to you with 3 items in that bag. And you can put together some notes. You can bring note cards or even a full sheet of paper with some notes jotted down on it. But you're going to explain each of your 3 items in the bag, and you're going to explain them and why they're important to you. It's a good way for me to get to know you a little bit better and you to get to know me a little bit better, as I'm going to be presenting my Any Old Bag speech to you. So I want you to consider those and think about those. That's going to happen on Wednesday at the beginning of class, and it'll be worth up to 10 formative points. We'll talk tomorrow about the syllabus. We'll go through some of the course expectations, and we'll continue this discussion of the communication model. So at this point, navigate to Blackboard, make that discussion board post, and you'll also get the assignment for the Any Old Bag speech. And I look forward to meeting all of you tomorrow.